Okay, so today we're going to put it all together. You're going to start by writing your first real program all on your own. To do that, we're going to use input and output only. So you've seen if statements, but we'll come back to those. Now, before we start on that, a couple of important things to sort of see here. Some Visual Basic terminology. Objects, properties, and events. You've probably heard me say these things now a couple of times, maybe not super clear on what's what. Pretty straightforward though. Objects are, like in the real world, things you can point at, things that you can see, things you could touch. For our purposes in Visual Basic, they are the buttons, they are the scroll bars, they are all the things that when you're in here, show up on your toolbox. Okay, so those are the things that when I put them on the computer screen, the computer realizes right away what they are. It sees them, it knows they're there, and it can identify them pretty easily. Properties are the different attributes, let's say, of the objects. So the things that change the way the object reacts, or more importantly, appears on the screen. When I go in here, you can kind of ignore this stuff. This was me playing around. But if I type something like label 1, now again, probably would be better if I had a better name than this, but for our purposes this works, and then I press the period, I see a list of things that I can change about my label, including the text that's in the label, of course, would be sort of the main one for you, but the size. Size is tricky, but it's based primarily on font. There's a height, there's different things here that we can work with to change the way the label appears on the screen. So two things. These are, first of all, the properties. Of course, they would appear over here under the properties window. When I have that label highlighted, I can see those same things over here. Second thing is, if you're looking to change an object that's on your screen and you don't necessarily know how to do it, just by typing the name, pressing the period as we just did, you can see a list of options that are available to you. That doesn't mean you can't ask, of course, but sometimes I don't know exactly what you're looking to do, and you might find something under there that saves you worrying about asking, first of all, and secondly allows you to figure out some things that maybe you'd be interested in. And the third important term here dealing with sort of the Visual Basic idea is the events. And events are the actions that can be performed. Okay, so it says here Visual Basic is event driven. So when we see something like this private sub, button click, Now again, the computer generates this, so I'm not going to be too concerned about what the is or the handles, button click stuff. Just know that when the computer makes that statement, it's correct and don't be messing with it. But what it does tell me is that I'm talking about button start here. I'm interested in when I click on the button start. So when the event is clicking on this object, the sub, the code inside the sub will run. Okay, so the events are all the options that are available to you. Here I'm looking at the button specifically. And again, the events that are available, there'll be a nice list of them, just like when I hit period on an object. If I click up here while within a sub, I can see all the different options for events that are available. And the button has a key down option. The button has a mouse click option, a mouse down option, a mouse hover option, and so on. So again, things you can kind of play with. They're not really part of programming in this course, but obviously they can affect the way your program runs, and they can be kind of neat. And so that's sort of your job at this point, is to use those as you need to, without wasting time on them while you're supposed to be doing the actual programming that is the course. Last thing then, this dim statement you've used a couple of times now and maybe haven't been totally an understanding of what you're doing. And so I'm just going to scroll back up here a little bit. Anything we dim, variables are dimmed, you sort of see that down here. Anything we dim in our program is a variable. The variable is just a storage spot in memory to hold information, either information typed by the user or information that the programmer wants to create to be able to use later on. The variable types that we're interested in, we've used integer already, and integer of course just stores an integer value, and it's an integer value within this range. Okay, so if you need numbers that are bigger than this or smaller than this, then you have to actually move to a long. You shouldn't probably ever end up there, but just kind of in your head know that there is a limit on this number, and you can actually see it if you try to type in something. Don't worry about this just now either, but when I type in, oh sorry, I should go the other way I guess. When I type in a statement here, it's telling me that I is an integer. The for loop you'll see in a bit. I'm assigning it values from this value to this value, and you can see that right away the computer underlines it and says this value does not represent an integer. Okay, so just sort of, if you try to use values that are outside the range, the computer will recognize it in one way or another and tell you that it's a problem. So the last variable type we're interested in, singles. Singles are used to store real numbers. I probably should have told you about that before, but I didn't. That's fine. So if you need decimals, use single. And then double is, again, similar to single in that it just holds larger decimal values and probably not of much use to you at this point. Boolean we'll see later on. And so just quick comments about variables. Variables are stored spaces, we said that. If they're dimmed at the very top of the code, so outside of, sort of right up here in your public class, then they exist for the whole program. If they're dimmed in the sub, they exist only in the sub. And so you have to sort of know that it's better to dim them in the sub most of the time, but sometimes when you need to keep track of something, again like a score or a money value that exists for the whole program, that's when you'll dim them at the top. It's bad programming practice to dim too many things at the top, so we will avoid that when we can. When we need to, we'll use it. So all of that to lead us to the input and output stuff. And there isn't a whole lot to say here. Sort of this is the quick note or quick reference, but it contains pretty much everything there is. For input, we have two options, the input box and a text box. By now, you've probably used both. And you can see the format is pretty straightforward. Age equals, or whatever the variable name is, equals input box. And this is what's going to show up on the screen, so the person using your program knows what he or she's supposed to do. Text box, basically you would draw a text box on the screen, probably put a label in front of it. And again, sort of the label, the idea of a label is that literally it's a label where you can't access, that the person using your program can't access it. Kind of like a label on a jar. It's just telling you what's there. The text box is where people can actually do work. They can actually type in information. And so somehow you want to make sure that on your screen it's obvious what that text box is for. The person puts their information in, and then when you run into it in the code, it says pull from that text box, store it in the variable called age. All work is done with variables. The input box and the text box, the only purpose they serve is to get the information into the computer. And I'm going to be very strict with that this year. You cannot put a text box into an equation. You should not put a text box into some sort of a message box or output statement. You put the information into the text box, you pull it into variables, and the variables are used after that. That's good programming practice. There's reasons for it, and it's pretty much so that stuff doesn't get changed on the screen while the program's running and have what shows up on the screen and what's actually running in the program be different. Okay, so absolutely will not allow for text box to be used in equations or text box to be used in any way other than exactly the same way the input box is used. The difference between the two, the only difference between the two, is that the input box happens at the moment when you run into it in the code. So your code's running and then it sees input box, the input box pops up, and the person must type their information in at that moment. The text box, of course, they could type into it at any point in time, and then in theory hit a button or something to tell the computer, now I'm ready, take that input and let's go. And then output box, or output options, sorry. Labels just displays on the screen, and message box pops the same message up on the screen, and just kind of you click OK and it moves away. Okay, so you'll notice, or you can probably notice looking at this, that what you see or what you write into a label box and what you write into a message box will basically be identical. If those are the words you want to have show up, then you would put brackets around them and stick them into a message box, and they would show up that way. A couple of keys here. If you want to get columns in your display, whether it's in a list box, which I haven't mentioned yet, whether it's in a message box or a label, the VB tab allows us to basically tab over to the next column and put in the information at that point. VB new line is another option. In the same way, just kind of stick it in between the two ampersands, and it will cause this information to drop down to the next line. So I haven't mentioned it, but I guess since it's right here, list box. Basically, a list box makes, big surprise, a box on the screen that contains a list. And to use it, you use the name of the list box, .items.add, and then basically just puts things down in a list on the screen and allows you to have multiple things displayed at the same time. The limitation with labels and message boxes is they pretty much contain one thing, and then once they're printed, you can't, if you print to them again, you overwrite what's already there. And then I guess just the final option, I threw these formatting things in here. If you want to make something that is showing up as 1 decimal place or 2 decimal places or something like that, these are your various options. Currency makes the $ show up. Fixed is automatically 2 decimal places. These number symbols indicate that you should display to 1 decimal place at most, and .0, for example, 1 decimal place always. So you can sort of see the difference here. 13.4 in both cases if the number is something like 13.4682999. But if it's exactly 12, it will display as 12 by itself, or 12.0 in this case. So you can get things to line up a little bit nicer if you're using this one, or if you want to guarantee everybody knows there's always 0 or always 1 decimal place, that would be an option as well. So I think I'm going to stop there. Again, the quick reference sheet is there for your purposes. There's examples of everything you'll be using pretty much all year there already, I think. And so look at it. Make sure anything you're typing looks very, very similar, if not exactly the same. And then we just got to get the commands in the right order, and things will start to work beautifully for us. Good luck.